should have said this yesterday, but I'll say it today instead. The speakers this week in chapel are coming out of the material that they're teaching in their classes. And so that was Ron coming out of Pastoral Epistles yesterday. Victor's coming out of Revelation today. Tomorrow Gibby will be coming out of 2 Corinthians. And on Friday, Level 2 and I will be coming out of Psalms. So that's kind of the setup for this week. Just thought it'd be good for those of us in those classes to hear the teachers apply in a sermon type form, in a devotional type form, worship type form, something that they're teaching. But also the rest of you could enjoy what we're studying together too in Level 2. So Victor, come preach the Word.
Well, good morning. I think it was last night about midnight or so, Charles called me and said, "Could you speak in chapel this morning?" At least that's the way it feels like because we've been so busy the last few weeks. But I'm happy to share with you this morning something from the book of Revelation. And he said, "God, could I have a look at a page in my book?" No, not that page, the other page. For I can't bear to look at that page. That page is a page which I wish could be ripped out and burned to pieces. That page is one which I wish I could forget. One which I wish I could erase from my memory. One I wish I could erase from the history of humanity. It's a page of my life that haunts me in the nights, invading my dreams and disturbing my mind during my waking hours. It's a page of shame and reproach. That page is the worst page of my life, so God, please, would you please turn that page and let me see the other page? You know the page which I mean? Yes, that page. That's better, much better. Let me just take a moment to read that page one more time, please. Thank you. In Revelation chapter 20 and verse 12, the text says, "And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works." In class a couple of weeks ago, as we're studying Revelation, I told the students to be careful in building doctrine out of the book of Revelation because it is a book that is filled with figurative language and strange pictures and concepts. So we have to be very careful. But what I want to share with you today has its roots in the Revelation, and I believe in a multitude of other passages outside the Revelation. The text speaks about, and we'll go in reverse order as far as the text is concerned. The text speaks about the book of life. The book of life evidently has as its origin the foundation of the world. In Revelation chapter 13 and verse 8, he's really talking about those who would worship the beast when he writes, "And all who dwell on the earth will worship him," that would be the beast, "everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of the life of the Lamb which has been slain." Commentaries will tell us that in ancient cities, and I guess it's still really true today, even in our world, that cities kept a register of the residents who lived in that particular city. And names could be added or otherwise deleted, just depending upon the situation. There were births, there were deaths, there were new residents, whatever, names were registered and names were removed. Banishment, for example, for any and every reason will result in the name being blocked out. And so we find in Revelation chapter 3, verse 5, as he's writing to the church in Ephesus, he says, "He who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels." The concept of the book of life is first suggested, I believe, in the book of Exodus, in chapter 32, verse 32 and 33, a passage that was read this morning. In part, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book." And in reality, and I think this is fair to apply it this way, this same concept is confirmed by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 10 and verse 20, where Jesus says, "Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven." And another thought in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 3, when he says, "Indeed, true comrade, I ask you also to help these women who have struggled in the cause of the gospel together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life." Now, as we're talking about the book of life and the other books we'll talk about in a moment, I don't think that God has a book literally there that he's writing names in, keeping records, but it's the idea. This speaks to our imagination, and the point of all this is that God knows us. He knows who we are. He knows what we're doing, and in his magnificent mind, he has a record of who we are and what we're doing and everything about us. And the book of life is not just, as you think about that, it's not just any kind of life, but it's the idea of eternal life. Now think about Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10 later, where he will say in that verse that those who are faithful unto death will receive what? The crown of life. The crown itself is a crown of life. It's not a crown like men would wear and kings and people like that. The crown itself is being crowned with life. We think of life, eternal life, being crowned with eternal life. You remember back in the story of Lazarus in John chapter 11. I'm going to pick up the reading in about verse 21. Martha therefore said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know whatever you ask of God, God will give you." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother shall rise again." Martha said to him, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." And then Jesus says to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." And then he says, do you believe this? He's talking about life. He's talking about believing in the concept, ultimately in the resurrection, that there will be life. Henry Drummond, who was a Scottish evangelist in the late 1800s, said, "Many men would be religious if they knew where to begin. Many would be more religious if they were sure where it would end. It's not indifference that keeps men from God, but ignorance. Good master, what must I do to inherit eternal life is still the deepest question of the age." For us, I want us to think just for a moment like this. And I think you know exactly what I mean when I say this. When we stepped into Christ, we stepped into eternity. Life, eternal life. How do you define eternal life? How do you imagine eternal life? Sometimes I try to think about the size of our universe. I don't do that very long because in my mind I reach the edge of the universe and then I ask myself, so what's beyond that? And it starts to boggle my mind, at least my mind anyway. So I have to stop and not really think about it. When I get to the edge of the universe in my mind, my imagination, I say, I'm done. I can't even begin to comprehend what would be beyond the edge, if there's an edge. And life, eternal life, what does it look like? Existence, eternal existence, what does that entail? So for you Trekkie fans, remember Star Trek, it says, space, the final frontier. No, it's life. Eternal life is the final frontier. And for those of you who are Trekkie fans, you know the parody where McCoy, the doctor, says, "It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it." It's life, eternal life, but not as we know it. Another preacher said something like this: eternity is said not to be an extension of time, but an absence of time. Now stop and think about that for a minute. Absence of time. No bells in the hallway. Silence. He goes on to say, eternity is said not to be an extension of time, but an absence of time. And sometimes it seems to me that her abandonment touches that strange mathematical point of endlessness. A point with no width, occupying no space. Time. Eternity. Eternity is, in essence, the absence of time. It is forever without end. That's eternal life, I think, maybe poorly and vaguely defined. So you come back to the book of life. The book of life is a book about life. It's about eternal life. And so I would say to you, so your name is in the book of life. You're destined for eternal life. But the big question is, will your name stay there? Socrates, who believed in immortality of the soul, said, if the soul is immortal, it demands our care not only for that part of time which we call life, but for all time. And indeed, it would seem now extremely dangerous to neglect it. What would a man give in exchange for his soul? The book of life, eternal life, it's ours to have. But I want to pursue this in a little bit different direction now based upon that. In Revelation chapter 20 and verse 12, I said I'm going to go backwards. The book of life is talked about, but then he also says in this, and I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. There is a book, and then there are books. Because he goes on to say, and the dead were judged from the things which are written in the books according to their deeds. It appears that those who would be believers, and in our case Christians, our names are written in God's book of life from the very foundation of the world. Point is something like this. Point of fact is that God knew. He knew who would choose to believe His word, and He knew who would choose to obey His commands, and therefore He knew who would be in His book. However, there's an all too clear reality and danger of one's name being erased from that very same book. And maybe it's therein lies the admonition from Paul in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12, to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Simply put, and maybe paraphrasing a little bit based upon the Greek, it might be something like this: bring your salvation to its final end. Bring it to its completion, but do so with fear and trembling. So in the big picture, your name is in the book. Well, we need to keep it there. Because while our names are in the book of life, one day the books will be opened. This principle from Revelation chapter 20 and verse 12 is that once the books are opened, all will be judged according to what is written in his or her book, as it were, according to his or her deeds. Now here's my point this morning. Who do you think is writing your book? You are. Just as I am writing my book, the book of our lives. The book from which you and I, your book, my book, the book from which I will be judged, the book from which you will be judged. A few years ago, when I was reading through Revelation, studying for another class, when I caught what this verse was saying, it changed my life. Because it made me more aware of who I am and whose I am. It caused me to kind of stand back and take a second look at what I'm writing in my book on a daily basis. And over time, I've come to realize that it's not what I'm doing today. Will that look good in my book? But it's rather, the question is, what I'm doing today, will it glorify God? Oh, it'll go into my book. But will it glorify God? The idea of being judged from our books, I think there's a similar thought in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10, when he says, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Remember? So that each one may be recompensed for the deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. Matthew Henry says, none are so mean, but they have some talents to account for. And none are so great as to avoid having to account for them. I reflect on Nehemiah. Nehemiah seemed to know about his book. He seemed to know about the idea of a record that was being kept, and you listen to his concern as you read through the book. 3 times Nehemiah will reflect upon his deeds. And in chapter 5, verse 19, he says, remember me, O God, for good, according to all I have done for this people. And then later, toward the end of his ministry, or at least what we have recorded, in chapter 13, verse 14, he says, "Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its service." And then the last note, chapter 13, verse 22, "Remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love." Nehemiah seemed very concerned about God remembering the things that he had done, as if he knew it was being recorded in a book. The writing of your book is not, now I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm getting ready to say here, lest you misunderstand part of my lesson. The writing of your book is not an earning of salvation through good deeds and works. Okay, that's not what it is. Rather, what it is, in the spirit of James, our good deeds and our works are complementing our faith. Our good deeds and our work are demonstrating our faith. They're proving our faith, yeah, even perfecting our faith, according to James chapter 2 and verse 22. In that whole section, James will say, "But someone may well say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.'" Verse 18. And then in verse 20 he says, "But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless?" Everything we say, everything we do, it's in our book. It's personal. Our works, our deeds, our faith, evidently even our tears. In the book of Psalms, chapter 56, verse 8, he says, "You have taken account of my wanderings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book?" Malachi chapter 3, verse 16, he writes, "Then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord gave attention and heard it. And a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear the Lord and who esteem his name." A book of remembrance for those who love the Lord, for those who esteem his name. I was reading that the city of London, there's a tombstone that I guess you could pass by and see what is written there. And what is written on the tombstone, the inscription simply says this: "Passerby, stop and think. I'm in eternity and you are on the brink." We all sit here this morning, we are on the brink of eternity. Right on the edge, right on the brink, never knowing exactly when this life will issue from here into eternity. So God, please, would you please turn that page and let me see the other page? You know which page I mean. Yes, that page. That's better, much better. Let me take just a moment and read that page one more time, please. So you sit here this morning and we're on the brink of eternity. And you're writing your book. Every time you pick up your pen, every time you open up that laptop, every time you stand up to speak, every time you talk to your spouse, interact with your kids, walk into the store, take an exam, you're writing your book. So here's my challenge for you. So tonight, when you go home and everything's quiet and you lie down on your bed tonight, I want you to think about kind of an assessment and think about what is in your book.
Thank you, Victor.